Hi everyone, welcome back to our channel. Beck's here today to film my wrap up for quarter 3 of 2023. So I'm just going to talk about each of the books that I've read between July, August, and September. Yeah, that's quarter 3 of the year. I have 9 books that I've read during this time, which is maybe slightly above average for me. In terms of how the reading quality was, there were a few books that were quite good, but a lot of them were sort of in the middle, but I'll get into it. So if you want to hear my thoughts on the last 9 books I've read recently, you can keep watching. The first book that I read in July was one that many of you will be familiar with, and that is Carrie, Soto is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is my 4th Taylor Jenkins Reid book. I've read the kind of 3 other ones that I think most people have read, her other sort of historical fiction books. So Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, Daisy Jones and the Six, and Malibu Rising. For Carrie, Soto is Back, I listened to it on audiobook, and I will say that the audio narration was meh, but I really liked the story. So Carrie Soto is a character that has made brief appearances before in other books. She's part of this whole web that Taylor Jenkins Reid has created. Carrie Soto is a retired, super famous tennis player. She broke all the records, has most Grand Slams. And unfortunately for Carrie, she's watching this up-and-coming tennis player get closer and closer to her record. And Carrie does not want this woman to beat her. Carrie's an incredibly competitive, driven person to the point of it being a nuisance sometimes. And so she decides at the age of 37 to start playing professional tennis again, and she enlists the help of her father, Javier, who was her coach back in the day. Tennis is definitely a big focus in this book, and as someone who does not particularly care for tennis, I found that the author did a really good job of making the training sessions and the games interesting, kind of shaking up how she would describe them, when she would describe things, when she would just kind of move forward and reflect on it afterwards. So yes, tennis is a big part of this. I learned a lot of tennis terms in here, but there is a lot going on with just the relationship with Carrie and her father, Carrie and other tennis players. There is interspersed snippets from the media reacting to Carrie's decision to start playing tennis again and how she's doing in these different Grand Slam tournaments. This book did end up being better than I thought it was going to be, and I gave it a 4.25 when I read it. And I think it could probably almost be a 4.5 at this point. There were moments that really moved me. I teared up. I mean, Javier, Carrie's father as a character is just, you just love him so much. And Carrie really grew on me. She's really hard to take at the beginning of the book, but you slowly kind of see where she's coming from, and she changes as a character. There's character growth in there, which is great. I would definitely recommend this if you've read other Taylor Jenkins Reid's books before and liked them. This is definitely worth your time. I think in the ranking of the books, it might be, I think Daisy Jones and the Six is still #1 for me, then Carrie, Soto is Back, then Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and then Malibu Rising. I think that's my new ranking. But yeah, I did have a really generally good time with this book. Next, I finished 2 books that are the only 2 in this group that I actually have physical copies of. So I reread the book of the Unnamed Midwife by Meg Ellison, and then I read the companion novel, the book of Etta. So this one is one that has been around for a while, and you've probably heard of it. It is a post-apocalyptic book. There is a massive fever that sweeps through the world and kills off a lot of the population. Of the people that are left, the majority are male, and the women that are left, childbirth is incredibly dangerous and results typically in death. And so a woman is a commodity at this point. Our main character is a woman. She was working as a nurse when all of this went down. And so she decides to live life as a man going forward for her own safety. And you follow her journey from waking up after being very sick herself. She did get the fever and survived, and sort of figuring out what's going on in the world. You're seeing as things continue to collapse around her, and then as she travels through the US surviving, interacting with the different people and the communities. This is a very dark book, and there are definitely dark themes explored in here. It's not for the faint of heart, but it is so powerful, and I just found it so compelling to follow her journey, even though I was reading it for the second time. I read this in 2021 originally, so it had been a little over 2 years when I picked it up again, and I was really excited to experience the story all over, and it was just as good the second time. If you like post-apocalyptic books and you haven't picked this up yet, please do. It is so, so good. I am not a huge rereader. I'm starting to get into it a bit more, but like, this is probably the fastest that I've ever reread a book. 2 and a bit years. I mean, in my adult life. Childhood doesn't count. But in my adult life, when my time is very, very valuable to me, to reread a book within that time frame just really speaks to how good this is. And the fact that I gave it 4.5 stars when I originally read it. Upon reread, considering how engaged I was, how I wanted to keep picking up the book, how much it still moved me the second time, this is a full 5-star read for me. Highly recommend. Then we move on to the companion novel. I reread the first book, 1, because I was very interested in doing so, and 2, because I wanted to have everything very fresh in my mind for this book. This one takes place approximately 100 years after the events of Unnamed Midwife, and this follows a different person, but there are lots of references to the first book. So it definitely is beneficial to have read the first one to understand what happened in the world before picking up this one, though this story is its own, once again, self-contained thing. You can read the first book and be completely fine and never read the other ones. It can be treated as a standalone. So in this book, we follow Etta, who is somebody who is a raider. She travels the roads and goes into old homes and interacts with once again, with people that she meets along the road and tries to bring things back to her community. When she's on the road, she goes by Eddie. And so in this book, it kind of flows between calling Eddie and Etta, and it depends on where they are, who they're interacting with. And this one is definitely not as good, unfortunately, as the first one. My favorite part of this book was following Eddie on the road and seeing them interact with these different communities and learning how these different communities functioned, because everyone was different. There was an overarching plot with this very bad person called the Lion, and I felt that the pacing with that and building up to that climax was just all wrong. Both of these books do explore LGBTQ themes, which I think is cool because it's done in a post-apocalyptic world, which is not what you typically see. However, in the first book, I thought it was done really well. It was there, it was reflected on a bit, but it didn't become the entire focus of the story. There was a lot of other things going on to keep you interested. With this one, I felt like the author took off more than she could really chew with the themes, kind of exploring Eddie and Etta and like who they wanted to be really on a day-to-day basis. They were saying the same thing over and over again about it, and so it kind of dragged down the story. I also felt like most of the characters that we met, I didn't like them. And then the ones that I did like, we never really saw again. And the characters that I didn't like kept coming back and being main players in the story, and it was just really starting to irk me after a while. And there is a third book in this, another companion story from someone who appears in this book, and based on what I read in here, I'm not continuing because I could not deal with the character that's going to be followed, or is followed in the third book. So unfortunately, this one ended up being 2 stars for me. It's like the first third was so good and was kind of had that flavor of what I was expecting and what I was wanting, and then the story really got bogged down by these annoying characters and the relationship that Etta and Eddie had with them, and then the pacing was just totally off with this overarching plot line with this bad guy. I'm good with this. This book is still fantastic, and I would not be surprised if I reread this again some point in the farther future, because this can exist completely on its own. But yeah, this one is just, it's not the same. It's not as good. Next, I read 2 graphic novels, which is also something that I don't do very often. The first one that I read is Kent State, 4 Dead in Ohio by Backderf. And shout out to my library, because I've been keeping my eye out for this book around, but couldn't find anywhere. My library didn't have it, so I requested it for my library to acquire. And because it is a hardcover, expensive graphic novel, they didn't want to buy it, but they did an interlibrary loan for me, and it came all the way from Barrie, Ontario. So it came from pretty far away to get here, all things considered. It wasn't like it was the next town over, so I really appreciated them doing that. I've never requested a book and had it come from someplace that far away. Anyway, this graphic novel covers 4 days around the Kent State Massacre, which happened in 1970. For someone who was not alive during that time, I was aware of this event, but I didn't really understand how it came to be. And my one really focal point is that picture, that very famous picture of the young woman screaming over the college student's body lying on the ground. That is kind of my point of reference for this. And when I saw there was a graphic novel about it, I thought that would be a really interesting way to learn more. And the author, Backderf, is their artist name, and they lived in Ohio at this time. So they were kind of pulling from an area of interest because they remembered this when they were a kid, but sort of digging into it and reflecting on it as an adult, it gave them a different angle on what was going on. And there was a lot of research that this author did in order to create this graphic novel. It is very text heavy because there is a lot to be explained. You're following a few key people, but you're getting a lot of background information as well. So there is a lot of text to provide the context to understand how something like this might happen. I didn't love the art style. It's just not a style that appeals to me generally, but I thought it still worked pretty well for getting this story across. And I learned a lot from this. It made me a bit angry and of course upset, because you learn about the people that were killed at this time and just sort of understanding how everything came together. If you're able to get your hands on it, if you're interested in learning more about this, I think this was a really cool way to learn about a very serious thing that happened in US history. The other graphic novel that I read is actually a graphic memoir, and that is Ducks, 2 Years in the Oil Sands by Kate Beaton. This one, I've been seeing a few different people talk about it, and so of course it was already on my radar, but what really drew me in is the fact that this is a Canadian story. Kate Beaton is from Cape Breton in Nova Scotia, and in order to pay off student loans, sort of get herself set up for the next phase of her life, she decides to go work in the oil sands in Alberta, which is a thing that a lot of people from communities that don't have a lot of options do. This is a very different art style from the previous book, and this one is definitely not as text heavy. There was a lot of kind of beautiful illustrations of the scenery, moments to pause, moments to take in. What this chronicles is her time there, the different positions that she had, and her kind of interactions with her fellow employees, and then also her journey mentally, because she knows she needs this money. It's very important for her to get it, but at the same time she's dealing with a lot of misogyny, hypermasculinity, and sexual harassment and assault, so definitely trigger warnings for that. Not only to herself, but to a lot of the other women around her that work there. There is definitely way more men, and that was very tiresome to read. Not in a way of I didn't want to read the book because it was annoying. It was as a woman and seeing these things, it was just, it's so tiring, and I haven't experienced things to the level that Kate has experienced, but I've certainly experienced versions of some of the things that she faced working in the oil sands, and so I could relate to some degree. There were a few times where I felt like scenes cut off a little early and I was kind of missing some information or wanted it to wrap up a little bit more cleanly, so, just tack on a few more pages. This is a big graphic novel, so a few more pages wouldn't have made much of a difference. But other than that, this was so moving, and I could connect with it on some level, even though I've never worked in the oil sands. But just a young woman trying to find her way in the world and dealing with all of these hard things. I think most people can relate to that on some level, and so it was just fantastic. It was really, really good. So I gave it a 4.5 out of 5. The next book that I read was one of 3 that I read in this quarter for the BookTube Prize nonfiction finals. I decided to be a judge for the final round. I'd already read 3 of the books previously, but there was 3 new ones to me. And if you want to get a bit more information on my final rankings and a little bit more in-depth thoughts about these books, I'll link my nonfiction finals ranking video, which is the one that I did right before this one. So the first book that I completed of those 3 was My Fourth Time We Drowned, Seeking Refuge on the World's Deadliest Migration Route by Sally Hayden. This is about the migrant crisis in Libya. There are many people traveling from different countries in Africa trying to make their way into Europe, whether they're just trying to make a better life for themselves or they're escaping conflict. Libya is a place where most of them meet, and then they try to take boats across the Mediterranean Sea. Sally Hayden is an Irish investigative journalist, and she ended up speaking with many of these migrants because they reached out to her via different social media platforms because they saw her name associated with different things. They were just looking for help. So Sally Hayden uses this book to tell the stories of a few different migrants with a lot of detail and kind of what they experienced. And then she also uses it to look at the greater picture, the governments involved, the NGOs involved. And this is an incredibly depressing book. It weighs on you. It is repetitive because you are hearing the same story basically over and over again. Abuse, torture, no food, little water, little sleep, sweltering conditions, people dying, and you're hearing different people's stories, but they're all kind of the same. They might be in different camps. The things might happen a little differently, but it's just a lot of the same thing over and over again, and it's hard to get through. I feel like Sally Hayden had a lot of things that she wanted to share, and so she just packed it all in this book. And I think if it had been cut down a little bit, and if the timeline had made a bit more sense, if the timeline had been more chronological, it might have been better. I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. So it's not a bad book by any means, but I think it could have been structured a bit differently, and that would have really improved it. The next book that I read was also an entry for the nonfiction finals for the BookTube Prize, and it is The Escape Artist, The Man Who Broke Out of Auschwitz to Warn the World by Jonathan Freedland. This book follows a man named Rudy who ended up in Auschwitz-Birkenau for a decent length of time, and him and his friend Fred decide to orchestrate a plan to break out of Auschwitz to warn the world, but specifically their fellow Jewish people, about what's going on there. They don't want these people to be coming in on these cattle cars and coming to Auschwitz and dying. At that time, it was one of those things where there were rumors, but a lot of people just didn't believe it. And so this chronicles Rudy's early life, how he ends up in Auschwitz, his time there, what he saw, what he did, the things that he experienced. And then there's a lot of build up and detail to the actual escape. And that whole part of the book was really interesting because you are working towards this moment that you know they do successfully accomplish, but to kind of see the ups and downs of getting there, it kept pulling me in. It kept making me want to read more. After they've broken out and they finally made it to safety, someplace they can hold out for a while, that's when the book started to shift. There was a lot of names being thrown out there, the political figures that we would recognize, but also just a lot of local political figures, people in the Jewish community, sort of the choices they made to warn people or to not warn people about what was happening. And that's when it really started to slow down, made it a bit harder to get through. And then the last chunk of the book is following Rudy once World War II is over, what he decided to do with his life, and also talking about how he's not a household name like Anne Frank or Schindler. And so that part was a little awkward for me. I felt like the conclusions that the author came to just didn't quite line up. I did end up giving this book 4 stars because there was such a large chunk of it that was incredibly compelling. But I do feel like the last bit of it, there was that one part where it got really slow. And then there was the other part, the other factor of what the author's conclusions were that just didn't quite sit right with me. So for that reason, I couldn't give it a 5. But yeah, it ended up being 4 stars. It's certainly, it's worth a read if it's something that interests you, but I wouldn't, you know, go like shouting from the rooftops that it's something that everybody needs to check out. The second to last book that I finished was The Caregiver by Samuel Park. This is one of those books that's been on my TBR, like want to read list for years. I saw it in a list of books being published whenever it came out. What year was that? It came out in like 2018. Yeah, so since 2018, this has been on my list. And I ended up seeing that it was available as an audiobook from my library, and I decided to finally give it a shot. This one is about a mother and daughter, and they live in Brazil. It's the 70s and 80s, and there's a lot of political upheaval at that time. We have a single mom, Anna, who's trying to care for her daughter, Mara. She's a voiceover actress, so she dubs films in English into Portuguese. But she doesn't make a ton of money from doing this, and so she's kind of looking for ways to support her daughter and make money. And so she ends up getting involved with this rebel group who are trying to take down a specific police officer in their area who's a really horrible person who tortures people, things like that. And so we kind of follow that one timeline, and then we also have a timeline in the 90s that is in Southern California, and we follow Mara as an adult, and she's working as a caregiver for a woman who has cancer. And so we have these 2 storylines that are running parallel to each other. And this point in time when Mara is in the 90s in Southern California, she's really taking the time to reflect on what happened when she was growing up in Brazil. And so you slowly learn that plot line. I liked both plot lines equally. At the beginning, I was a little like nervous. I was kind of leaning more towards the 90s plot line, but then the one in Brazil really started to build up, and there was a lot of tension there. And there was some tension and interesting things created in the 90s plot line too. My favorite parts of the story were the 2 relationships that Mara had, the one with her mother and then the one for the woman that she was the caregiver for. There was a lot of really like beautiful moments with those, especially the woman she was caring for. I do feel like the plot points with other characters in the story, interactions that Mara had with them, they didn't quite flow and work out the way I would have wanted, and it kind of left me feeling like I almost wish they hadn't the author hadn't introduced, you know, that particular plot line, and they just kind of focused even more on like the caregiver relationship. In the end though, I did give it 3 stars. I had a good time with the story, and I appreciated reading about a time in history in Brazil that I really didn't know anything about. The final book that I read in Q3 was the 3rd book for the BookTube Prize Nonfiction Finals, and that is Eating to Extinction, The World's Rarest Foods and Why We Need to Save Them by Dan Saladino. I saved this book for last with the 3 books that I needed to read because I figured it would be the one that I would be least into, and I was correct. I don't really care to read about food. I don't care to read about cooking, and this kind of focused on that a lot. And so it was really hard to get through at times. It is, I will say, very well structured. It's broken up into different sections where you're kind of focusing on different food groups, and then within each section there are chapters focusing on very specific things. The beginning part was a slog. We were focusing on cereals, vegetables, fruits, and I just didn't care. Then it started to move into things that I cared about a bit more: cheese, alcohol, and I really liked how the author ended with sweets and focused on how food can really tie us back to the place that we come from, even if we can't live there anymore. Throughout this book, there is the running line of how we need diversity in the food that we eat, like genetically, because if we only have one type of wheat that we're eating and there's some sort of blight that comes along, we're in a lot of trouble because we've lost most of the wheat that we eat. And so this book talks a lot about that, talks about also how climate change really affects what is being grown, and how farmers have started focusing on one crop that grows really fast because you can just produce that much more, and how those might be great in some aspects, but in other aspects it really becomes a problem. So that's sort of the running thing throughout the book. It was a little repetitive because every section would sort of end with a reminder about this. It was all tying back to what the author was trying to get across, and at least he did get his point across, I will say that. So I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 because there was a lot of it that was a slog to get through, but there was some really good parts. And I also recognize that this book is just not really for me, but it is well done. It's very well done. So yeah, 3.5 out of 5, but keeping in mind that this is just not a topic that I ever would typically read about. All right, those are the 9 books that I finished in Q3 of 2023. Feel free to let me know what you thought of any of these books if you've read them, and you can also let me know what you managed to read in the last few months. As always, our links are in the down bar. You can go check those out if you feel so inclined. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you later.